Mute all. Okay, so the Torah portion this week also, as last week, is special for Passover. So we depart from the regular weekly Torah readings this Shabbat and have a special reading for the 8th day of Passover. So I just want to pause for a moment to talk about this. In Israel, the holidays are observed as the Torah says they should be observed. So 7 days for Passover, 7 days for Sukkot, 1 day for Shavuot. Okay, the extra day is added outside of Israel because that's how the rabbis in the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud determined that people, in order to ensure that the holiday is celebrated at the right time, add the extra day. So this only makes sense to do in a time when the calendar was not set ahead of time. Back in the time of the rabbis, witnesses would report to the temple in Jerusalem, to the rabbis there, testifying that they saw the new moon. The rabbis would corroborate their testimony and then send out the signal, which would be in the form of bonfires lit on mountaintops throughout the land of Israel to outside of its borders, to say that the new moon, the new month, has just been established. So when it takes the signal fires a long time to reach outside of the boundaries of the land of Israel, it could be confusing which day is the new month. So outside of Israel, an extra day of the holiday is added. That's why we do 2 days at the beginning and 2 days at the end for Passover, same for Sukkot, same for Shavuot. Now that the calendar is set, you just go to a website called Hebcal, Hebcal, and you just randomly put in a date 1,000 years from now, even, the Hebrew equivalent will come up. So the calendar is all set, and the argument can be made and has been made within the conservative movement, if not in other denominations too. Why do we need to maintain the extra day of the holiday? We all have the calendar now. It's all set. We should all be on the same page. And most of the Jewish community has answered that by saying there is a spiritual religious value in maintaining a difference in observance between being in Israel and not being in Israel. So that there's a sense, there are other elements of this, not just about holidays, where it is holier to be in Israel than it is not to be in Israel. And therefore, there is an extra layer of sanctity to being in Israel than there is being a Jew anywhere else in the world. So the argument is maintained, especially among those Zionist Jews, that we, I wouldn't say punish ourselves. We just say that this is the state of being Judaism if you're not, being Jewish if you're not in Israel, that you get an extra day of the holiday. If you want to have only 1 day of the holiday, then go to Israel. So I happen to agree with that argument, which it would be the same for why we pray for dew on the first day of Passover and pray for rain at the end of, on Shmini Atzeret, at the end of Sukkot, to maintain our association and connection with the land and the state of Israel. So all that, yes, Arnie. Yes, go ahead.
Though I understand and sort of knew this argument for a long time, I just want to say, it seems like the original reason went away,
Right.
and that so what the rabbis did was search around for another reason.
Yeah.
So that doesn't feel right to me, because the reason was the reason. The
Yeah.
reason
No,
went away. The restriction should go away.
no, you're right. You're right. And that's the argument you can make for eating rice and beans and legumes on Passover. Okay, so the argument isn't there anymore. It was just something that Ashkenazi rabbis added for to make a safeguard to how people shopped in the Middle Ages, and how the rice and the beans would be next to the wheat and the barley in the marketplace, and one could be mixed in with the other. And then also how you cook it looks the same as how you cook wheat and barley. So now that we know that those reasons aren't there anymore, and you can rest assured when you buy rice and beans today, 100% natural rice and beans and corn, that there's no chametz mixed in, you can eat it. So the underlying reason why people still do not eat, Ashkenazi do not eat rice and beans and corn on Passovers, is tradition. So the argument for the second day of the holiday, I think, is a deeper argument than tradition. Okay, because you're right, the reason there is no longer there. We have the calendar is set. There's no reason why the Jewish community should not be united, both outside of Israel and inside of Israel. But there's the other reason of, should we maintain a difference in our spirituality between being in Israel and not being in Israel? And that's an argument that is made not just about observing the holidays, but about other aspects of being Jewish too. Okay, and that's why I think the argument for maintaining a second day of the holiday is still a strong one today. There are conservatives, the Reform movement gave it up a long time ago and understood, hey, we're a Bible-based religion, the Reform movement says. So they have one day off, and they even extend the one day to Rosh Hashanah, which everywhere around the world, it's a 2-day Rosh Hashanah. And some Reform synagogues do offer a second day Rosh Hashanah service. Some do. So because the argument about second day Rosh Hashanah is different than the other, than why for the other holidays. So I think there's that. So if we are not as strongly Zionist, let's say we are firmly rooted in the diaspora and are proud to be American Jews, you can make the argument that we should only have one day of the holiday. But again, because I'm deeply rooted in Zionism, and I do feel a spiritual reason for maintaining a difference for being in Israel versus not being in Israel, that's why I think it's still a cogent argument to maintain 2 days of Yom Tov.
So that raised another interesting question. Do like the really anti-Israel Orthodox groups like Satmar and those, do they have 2 days outside of Israel?
They do have 2 days. Yes, they do 2 days outside of Israel. They're just waiting for the Messiah to come in order to go back to Israel. Okay. That's what they're waiting for, and they think it's a shanda that any Jew would establish a state of Israel before the Messiah comes. So it's more than a shanda; it's a desecration of God's name for doing that. So no, they have 2 days of Yom Tov, but I think that those that live in Israel who are the anti-Zionists do only have 1 day of Yom Tov. Okay. Because they're living. So the living in Israel is independent of whether the Messiah has come or not. Okay, it's always a mitzvah to live in Israel, whether the Messiah has come or not. It's establishing autonomy and authority and government that we wait until Messiah, because the government should be a descendant of King David. Anything else, this Knesset and everything else is a shanda. Okay, so all of this was a tangent to why this coming Shabbat, the Torah reading in Israel is different than the Torah reading outside of Israel. Outside of Israel, it's the 8th day of Passover. In Israel, it's already not Passover anymore. Passover will end in Israel on Friday night. However, living in Israel, you have an extra day of eating matzah. You cannot switch your house over Friday night to chametz because there's work involved in doing that, and you can't do work on Shabbos. So they will eat matzah, and it'll still be chametz free in Israel this Shabbat, but it will be considered a regular Shabbat. So in Israel, they will be reading the portion Acharei Mot. We won't be reading Acharei Mot until next week. So I checked, and on RavNet, the listserv for conservative rabbis, somebody posted what the Torah readings are in Israel for the next several weeks. We don't hook up again with Torah readings to be the same until the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av. Sometimes it gets fixed by Shavuot, but this year it's not fixed because it's a leap year. So it's not fixed that we're on the same page again until the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, which is Shabbat August 6th. So until then, we will be out of sync with Israel when it comes to the weekly Torah reading. Okay, so that was 13 minutes of our time talking about second day of Yontif. So the reading this Shabbat for 8th day of Passover is found on page 1074 in the Eitz Chaim, which is the beginning of the 5th aliyah of the portion Re'eh, which is Deuteronomy 14, verse 22. So Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22 is where the Torah reading for 8th day of Passover begins. And this is an extended description of tithing and where to what to do with the tithe produce, and also to support the Levi, the orphan, and the widow in the community. And then chapter 15 all the way through to verse 18 talks about the sabbatical year. So we're not going to have the time to look through everything. Let's look instead at the 6th aliyah, the start of chapter 15 on page 1076. And we'll have time to talk a little bit about why this is read on the 8th day of Passover. Because we would imagine reading something from the Torah that has to do with Passover on the holiday. We don't have the Passover connection with the reading until later in chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, which talks about all the holidays and why they're celebrated throughout the year. So the question would be, why not just read chapter 16 on the 8th day of Passover? Why do we have all this other material? So let's start with chapter 15, 1076 in the Eitz Chaim. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 15, the 6th aliyah of the portion Re'eh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shekitzanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Miketz sheva shanim ta'aseh shmita. At the end of 7 years, you practice a sabbatical year. That's how I translate it, but it is remission of debts. That's how it's translated here. V'zeh davar hashmita. This shall be the nature of the remission. Shamot kol baal mashe yado asher yasher bere'ehu. Every creditor shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow. Lo yigos et re'ehu v'et achiv. He shall not dun his fellow or kinsman. Ki kara shmita ladonai. For the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. Et hanochri tigos. You may dun the foreigner. V'asher yeh lacha et achicha tashmet yadecha. But you must remit whatever is due you from your kinsman. Okay, so the portion Bahar in Leviticus talks more extensively about this sabbatical year, how every 7th year is a remission of debts and also letting the land lie fallow. Okay, So Shemitah is understood more as letting the land lie fallow, but it's also this remission of debts. So it's an economic, it's like it's a recalibration or pushing reset or a restart on your computer. So every seventh year you start from scratch. So if you owe money to somebody, you know that in the seventh year that loan will be forgiven, and you can start over again. You get a fresh start. Okay, so FS Kilo Yebecha Evyon, there shall be no needy among you. Ki varech yeverechacha Adonai, ba'aretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha nachala lerishta. There shall be no needy among you, since the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion. Right? Follow the covenant, then you don't have to worry about being in debt, because the land will work for you. It'll be productive for you. You'll have enough of a harvest to support your families at least. So you won't have to worry. There will never be poor people. And again, the underlying assumption is if you follow in God's ways. Well, not underlying assumption, because verse 5, Rak im shamoa tishma b'kol Adonai Elohecha, as if only you heed the Lord your God, lishmor la'asot et kol hamitzvah la'asot, and take care to keep all this instruction, lishmor la'asot kol mitzvah zot asher anochi mitzavacha hayom, that I enjoin upon you this day. Just follow the commandments. There won't be poor people. Ki Adonai Elohecha beirachacha, for the Lord your God will bless you, ka'asher diber lach, as he has promised you. Ve'ha'avatata goyim rabim, you will extend loans to many nations. Ve'ata lo ta'avot, but require none yourself. Umashalta begoyim rabim, you will dominate many nations. Uvacha lo yimsholu, but they will not dominate you. Okay, so now God says there won't be any poor. You don't have to worry about this remission of debts as long as you follow all of the commandments. But verse 7, Ki yehiyavecha evyon, if, however, there is a needy person among you, right? So in other words, God already knows that all the people are not going to be following all the commandments. So here's the plan for when you don't follow the commandments, and there will end up being poor people among you. Ki yebecha evyon me'achad achecha be'achad sha'arecha be'artzecha asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach, lo ta'ametzet lavavecha ve'lo tikpotzet yadecha me'achicha ha'evyon. If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Ki fatoach tiftach et yadecha lo, v'ha'avet ta'avitenu de machsaro asher yachsar lo. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. So we don't have much more time to go on with the rest of this chapter, but I wanted to talk about this, because why is this read on Passover? So we have in the Haggadah, Kol dichvin yetei v'yechol, all who is hungry, let him come and eat, right? So we say that in the Haggadah as one of the requisite lines that we say, right? Halachma Anya, right? It's in the Halachma Anya section. Here, behold this. So we say this in Aramaic. This bread of the poor, or this poor people's bread, or this bread of affliction, however we translate it. We're welcoming everyone in the community to come into our homes and eat. So there's, in the Haggadah, we have a reminder to be hospitable and to take care of the poor. This time of year, if we were farmers in the land of Israel, we'd be focused on the spring rebirth of the ground and the new produce and the new harvest coming in. We might be feeling very selfish and greedy about the produce, making sure that we have enough. And so as we, instead of being greedy and selfish, the Torah here is reminding us, no, don't get focused. Don't allow yourself to be greedy as you're harvesting the spring crops. Remember that there are poor people in your community and that you are obligated to support them, right? And leaving the corners of your fields, that's what we read on the second day of Passover from that section in Leviticus about the holidays there, about leaving the corners of the field for the poor. Exactly right. So yes, but here specifically for the 8th day of Passover, we're reminded again to support the needy and the poor. So while we are harvesting, while we are celebrating the holiday, while we're taking care of our family and feeding our families over the course of Passover, we are obligated to remember the poor in the community. So that's why on the 8th day of Passover, we don't just start with chapter 16 to be reminded of how to observe all the holidays throughout the year. We're added onto this chapter, which reminds us that there are always going to be poor among you and that we have to take care of them. Okay, let's stop here for today. I appreciate your understanding and flexibility with a shorter class today. We'll meet again next Wednesday and have a fuller session, I hope, on the portion Acharei Mot at that time. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. Take care. Enjoy the rest of Passover. Moadim l'simcha. Have a good holiday and Chag Sameach for the end of this week. And Shabbat.
Yash koach.
Thank you.
Hag Sameach.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach.
Have a good day, everyone.